The howl tore out of Cale Ashbourne before he even knew he was going to make a sound. He was standing in the middle of the war room, surrounded by maps and pins and the low murmur of his generals, when his wolf slammed against his ribs so hard that he grabbed the edge of the table to stay upright. The candles on the wall flickered. Every head turned toward him. He forced his spine straight, forced his jaw shut, and told the room it was nothing. But it was not nothing. It had not been nothing for 6 weeks. Cale was the Alpha King of the Ashbourne territory, the largest wolf kingdom for 300 miles in any direction. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he walked past. Rival packs sent envoys with gifts instead of threats, because everyone had heard what happened to the last pack that tried to test him. He had built a reputation out of control, out of never losing his temper, never showing weakness, never letting the wolf inside him take the wheel. And now, for 6 weeks, that same wolf had been trying to claw its way out of his chest every single night, pulling him toward one direction of the castle, like a compass needle finding north. The kitchens. It made no sense. Kings did not get pulled toward kitchens. Kings got pulled toward battlefields, toward thrones, toward the scent of blood or the scent of danger, not toward the smell of bread and broth and someone's laughter drifting out through a cracked door. But that was exactly where his feet kept taking him, night after night, and he was starting to lose the fight to stop it. Alpha. Dorian's voice cut through the haze. Dorian was his beta, had been since they were pups running through the training yard together, and he was the only person in the castle who dared to say Cale's name without a title in front of it when they were alone. "You've gone somewhere else again." "I'm here," Cale said, though his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Dorian studied him with narrowed eyes, the kind of look that saw straight through excuses. "You've said that 4 times this week. Each time you were looking at the east wall like it owed you money." The east wall. Of course Dorian had noticed. The east wall was the direction of the kitchens, and Cale had been staring at walls, doors, and windows that faced that part of the castle for over a month now, as if his eyes could see through stone if he just concentrated hard enough. "I'm tired," Cale said. "The border talks with the Greyfen pack have kept me up." It was a lie, and from the way Dorian's mouth flattened into a thin line, they both knew it. But Dorian let it go, because that was what a good beta did. He let his king have his secrets, right up until the moment those secrets became a danger to the pack. The meeting finally ended an hour later, well past midnight, and Cale dismissed his generals with a wave of his hand. The moment the heavy doors shut behind the last of them, his wolf surged forward again, sharper this time, more insistent, and Cale found himself walking. Not toward his bedchamber, not toward the balcony where he sometimes stood to clear his head. He was walking toward the east wing, before he had even decided to move his feet. He told himself it was hunger. That was the excuse he had been using for weeks, the one that let him keep some shred of dignity, while his wolf dragged him through dim corridors, like a leashed dog pulling toward a park. He was the king. Kings did not sneak toward kitchens in the dead of night, because some instinct they didn't understand told them to. And yet here he was, boots silent on stone, heart beating faster with every step, as if his own body knew something his mind refused to accept. The kitchen door was cracked open, warm golden light spilling out into the dark hallway. Cale slowed his steps. He should turn around. He should go back to his room, sleep, wake up in the morning as the composed, unshaken king his people needed him to be. Instead, he found himself standing just outside that sliver of light, breathing in air that smelled like cinnamon and something warmer underneath it, something that made his chest ache in a way he had no name for. He pushed the door open. The kitchen at that hour should have been empty. The staff finished their work hours before midnight, banked the fires, and went to their quarters to sleep before the sun rose and the whole cycle started again. But there, at the far end of the room, a single woman stood over a pot on a low flame, stirring slowly, humming a tune under her breath that Cale did not recognize but somehow felt like he had heard before, in a dream he couldn't remember. The moment his eyes landed on her, everything in him went still. His wolf, which had been clawing and pacing and howling inside him for 6 straight weeks, simply stopped. It was like plunging into cool water after standing too long in the heat. Every nerve in his body that had been stretched tight for over a month suddenly loosened, and for one long, disorienting second, Cale forgot how to breathe. She had not noticed him yet. She was focused on the pot, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, a few strands of dark hair falling loose from the braid down her back. She was not dressed like nobility, not dressed like anyone who mattered in the world of politics and packs and power that Cale lived in every day. She wore a simple kitchen apron dusted with flour, and there was a small burn mark on her wrist that she must have gotten from the oven earlier that evening. She looked tired. She looked ordinary. And his wolf had never been this calm in his entire life. Cale did not know how long he stood there in the doorway, watching a stranger stir a pot of soup, before some instinct in her finally caught the sense of being watched. She turned, and for a moment her eyes went wide with alarm, the kind of fear anyone would feel finding an unexpected figure looming in a dark doorway at midnight. Then she seemed to recognize the crown stitched into the collar of his coat, the mark that only the Alpha King wore, and her alarm shifted into something closer to confusion. "My lord." She dropped into a quick, awkward bow, nearly knocking the wooden spoon off the edge of the pot in her haste. "I'm sorry. I didn't hear anyone come in. Is something wrong? Do you need something from the kitchen?" Cale opened his mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in years, that he had no idea what to say. He looked around the room, as if the walls might offer him an excuse. "I was hungry." It came out clumsy, almost like a boy caught sneaking sweets rather than a king who commanded armies. The woman blinked at him, clearly not expecting the great Alpha King to explain himself to a kitchen worker at midnight, but she recovered quickly, the way people who worked hard for a living always learned to do. "Of course, my lord. Let me find you something." She set the spoon down and moved toward the pantry shelves, careful and quick, and Cale watched her the entire time, unable to look away, unable to explain to himself why his heart was still pounding, even though his wolf had gone so quiet and so content. "You're new," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say that wasn't insane. "I don't remember seeing you before." "I started 3 weeks ago, my lord. Elena." She said her name softly, almost like she wasn't sure she was allowed to give it to him. "I work under the head cook, mostly soups and breads." Elena. He turned the name over in his mind like it was something precious, something he wanted to hold on to. She returned a moment later with a small plate of bread and cheese, setting it carefully on the table nearest him, keeping a respectful distance the entire time, as if she understood, without being told, that kings were not meant to be approached too closely. "Thank you," Cale said, and he meant it more than the simple words could carry. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, the kind of smile that people gave when they were not sure if it was appropriate to smile at all, and then she excused herself, saying she needed to finish the soup before it burned, and returned to her place at the stove. Cale sat at the table with the plate in front of him, untouched, and watched her work. She moved with quiet efficiency, stirring, tasting, adjusting the seasoning with small pinches from jars she clearly knew by memory. She hummed again, softer this time, as if she had forgotten he was there, or perhaps as if she felt safe enough in his presence to forget. Either thought sent something warm and unfamiliar curling through his chest. He should have left. Every rule of decorum, every instinct of self-preservation that had kept him alive and in power for years, told him that a king did not sit in an empty kitchen at midnight staring at a servant like a lovesick fool. But his wolf, calm and steady for the first time in weeks, would not let him move. "Is the soup good?" he asked, if only to break the silence, if only to hear her voice again. She glanced over her shoulder, surprised he had spoken again. "It's for the morning, my lord, for the staff who wake before dawn. It's nothing fancy. I'd still like to try it." Something flickered across her face, surprise mixed with a kind of nervous pleasure, and she ladled a small amount into a cup and brought it to him. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, barely a touch, barely anything at all, but Cale felt it travel up his arm like a spark of lightning, and judging by the way Elena's breath caught and her eyes widened just slightly before she pulled her hand back, she had felt something too. Neither of them said anything about it. She returned to her stove. He drank the soup slowly, savoring it far longer than any bowl of simple broth deserved, and told himself that the tightness in his chest was nothing more than exhaustion catching up with him after a long week. He stayed another 20 minutes, asking small questions about where she had come from, receiving careful, guarded answers in return. She was not from the capital. She had traveled from farther north, looking for steady work, and the castle had been kind enough to take her on. She did not offer more than that, and Cale, sensing the walls she had built around herself, did not push. He recognized guarded silence when he saw it. He carried enough of his own. When he finally rose to leave, his wolf let out a low, unhappy sound at the thought of walking away from her, but Cale forced himself toward the door anyway. At the threshold, he paused and looked back one last time. "Thank you for the meal, Elena." "Of course, my lord." She bowed again, quick and proper, and turned back to her work before he had even left the room. Cale walked the corridors back to his chambers in a daze, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer. Why had his wolf gone silent the moment he saw her? Why had a simple accidental touch felt like more contact than he'd had in years? Why, when he closed his eyes that night, could he still hear the soft, uncertain melody of her humming? He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that exhaustion and stress had made him imagine a connection where there was none, that tomorrow his wolf would go back to its usual restless pacing, and everything would return to normal. But when he woke the next morning, the first thought in his mind was her name. And when night fell again, his wolf pulled him back toward the kitchen without hesitation, stronger and more certain than it had ever pulled him before, as if some part of him already understood a truth his conscious mind was nowhere near ready to accept. Somewhere deep inside him, buried under years of duty and control, and the walls he had built to survive being a king, something ancient and patient had finally found what it had been searching for. It did not care about titles or stations or the impossible distance between a crown and a kitchen apron. It only knew that the woman with flour on her hands and a song on her lips was the missing piece he had spent his whole life not knowing he was searching for. Cale Ashbourne did not know it yet. Not fully, not consciously. But his wolf already knew. And it was not going to let him forget. Elena Marsh had learned a long time ago that the safest place in any castle was the kitchen, because kings and nobles rarely looked twice at the people who cooked their food. She had come to Ashbourne territory 3 weeks earlier, with nothing but a small bag of clothes, and a fear that followed her like a shadow, and she had chosen this job precisely because it promised her the thing she wanted most in the world, to be invisible. She had not expected the Alpha King to walk into her kitchen at midnight and look at her the way he had looked at her. She told herself it was nothing. Kings were unpredictable. Perhaps he often wandered the castle at strange hours, checking on his people, making sure his household ran the way he wanted it to run. Perhaps the odd warmth that had spread through her chest when their fingers brushed over that cup of soup was simply nerves, the natural reaction of a servant suddenly finding herself alone with the most powerful man in the region. But Elena had grown up hearing stories about wolves and their mates, stories her mother used to whisper to her before bed, back when her mother was still alive to whisper anything at all. She knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, what that warmth might mean. She just refused to let herself believe it, because believing it was dangerous, and Elena had promised herself she would never again let herself want something that could get her hurt. She kept working through the following days as if nothing had happened, scrubbing pots, kneading dough before dawn, memorizing the rhythms of a kitchen that ran like clockwork under the sharp but fair eye of the head cook, a stout, kind woman named Margaret who had worked in the castle for over 20 years and missed absolutely nothing. "You're distracted," Margaret said on the third morning after the midnight visit, watching Elena nearly spill a tray of unbaked rolls. "What's got into you, girl?" "Nothing," Elena said quickly. "Just tired." Margaret gave her a long look, the kind of look older women gave when they knew exactly what was going on and were deciding whether or not to say so out loud. In the end, she said nothing, only handed Elena a fresh tray and told her to slow down before she burned something, and Elena was grateful for the silence, because she did not have words yet for what she was feeling. It happened again 2 nights later. Elena was staying late to finish preparing dough for the morning bread, alone in the kitchen the way she preferred, when the door opened, and the Alpha King stepped through it, as if he belonged there, as if this were the most natural place in the world for a king to be standing at 11 at night. Her heart did something strange and sudden, a leap and a stumble at the same time. "My lord." She straightened immediately, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Is there something you need?" "No," Cale said, and then seemed to catch himself, as if he had not meant to admit that so plainly. I was passing by." Elena knew, the way anyone who worked in a busy household knew things without being told, that the kitchens were nowhere near anything a king would be passing by at this hour. The royal chambers were on the opposite side of the castle entirely, but she said nothing, only nodded and returned to her dough, painfully aware of him standing near the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm. "You don't have to stop what you're doing," he said after a moment, when it became clear she had gone quiet and stiff under his gaze. "I wasn't sure if I should keep working in front of you, my lord." Something in his expression shifted, something almost like discomfort. "You don't need to treat me differently than you would anyone else in this kitchen." Elena wanted to laugh at that, though she kept the sound trapped behind her teeth. He was the Alpha King. There was no version of the world where she could treat him like anyone else, and they both knew it. But she appreciated the offer, even if it was impossible to accept, and so she gave him a small nod and kept kneading, and he pulled out a stool from the corner and sat, watching her work in comfortable silence. It became a pattern after that. Not every night, but often enough that Elena began to notice the shape of it, the way he would appear sometime after the rest of the castle had gone quiet, always with some flimsy excuse about hunger, or restlessness, or passing by, always staying longer than any of those excuses required. She never asked him to leave. She told herself that was because it was not her place to send a king away from any room in his own castle, but the truth, buried somewhere she did not want to look too closely at, was that she had started to like the sound of the door opening at that hour, started to feel a quiet disappointment on the nights he did not come. She learned small things about him during those visits, fragments offered slowly, the way a man used to guarding every word carefully, gave things away only when he trusted the silence around him. He had lost his parents young. He had taken the crown before he was ready for it, forced into leadership by circumstances no one his age should have had to face. He rarely slept well. He did not have many people he could speak freely with, and though he never said it outright, Elena began to suspect that she had somehow, impossibly, become one of the very few. She, in turn, gave away almost nothing. She spoke of small, safe things, recipes, the weather, funny stories about the other kitchen staff. She never mentioned the pack she had come from, never mentioned the reasons she had run as far south as her feet could carry her, never mentioned that some nights she still woke gasping, certain she could hear footsteps behind her that were not there. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into this strange new routine, Cale arrived looking different than usual, tense, distracted. He sat on his usual stool but said almost nothing, staring at the low fire in the hearth as if it held answers to questions he could not voice. "Rough day, my lord?" Elena asked carefully, setting a cup of tea in front of him without being asked. He looked up at her, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded crossed his face, before he managed to smooth it away. "The Greyfen pack is threatening our northern border again. If it comes to open conflict, a lot of people are going to get hurt." Elena's chest tightened with a sympathy she had not expected to feel for a king. "Is there nothing that can be done to avoid it?" "I'm trying." His hands wrapped around the cup she'd given him. Not quite tight enough to be a fist, but close. "I've spent my whole life trying to keep this territory from bleeding, and some days it feels like it's never enough." She did not know what made her do it. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in his voice, or the way his shoulders had curled inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, or perhaps it was simply the same restless, warm feeling that had been building in her chest for 2 weeks and finally found somewhere to go. She reached out and set her hand over his, just for a moment, just long enough to say without words that he was not as alone in that room as he believed himself to be. The reaction was immediate and impossible to hide. Cale's whole body went still, his breath catching audibly, and when Elena realized what she had done, she pulled her hand back quickly, cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry, my lord. I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize." His voice came out lower than usual, rougher. "Please." They looked at each other across the small space between them, and for one suspended moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, caught in something neither of them understood, but both of them clearly felt. Then a sound from the hallway, footsteps of a night guard making his rounds, broke the spell, and Cale stood abruptly, muttering something about needing rest, and left the kitchen faster than he had arrived. Elena stood alone by the hearth for a long time afterward, staring at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake turning the moment over and over, remembering the way his breath had caught, the way his eyes had gone dark and focused entirely on her, and she told herself, over and over, that whatever this was, It could not be what her mother's old stories described. It could not be a fated bond. Kings did not end up fated to cooks. The world simply did not work that way, and Elena had learned the hard way not to hope for things the world was never going to give her. But somewhere beneath the fear and the careful walls she had spent years building, a small, stubborn hope had already taken root, and no matter how firmly she told herself to ignore it, it refused to leave. 3 days later, he did not come to the kitchen at all, called away suddenly to deal with the worsening situation at the border, and Elena was surprised by how sharply she felt his absence, like a held breath she could not release. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she barely knew him, that whatever strange connection had sparked between them over shared tea and quiet conversation meant nothing in the larger scale of a kingdom's troubles. She told herself a lot of things that week. None of them were true. Margaret noticed everything, and it did not take her long to notice the change in Elena. It started small, the kind of thing most people would never catch. Elena burned a batch of rolls she had made 100 times before, without ever ruining a single one. She stood at the window during her break, staring out at nothing, until Margaret had to call her name twice to get her attention. She flinched when the kitchen door opened, and there was a particular kind of hope in her flinch, that Margaret, who had lived a long life, and seen a great many young women fall into feelings they did not know how to name, recognized instantly. "You've caught something," Margaret said one afternoon, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. "I'm not sick," Elena said quickly. "Not that kind of catching." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes sharp and knowing beneath her graying eyebrows. "You know exactly what I mean, girl." Elena's face went hot, and she busied herself with a stack of dishes rather than answer. Margaret did not push further, but that night, as they closed the kitchen together, she spoke again, her voice gentler than before. "Whatever's growing between you and our king, tread carefully. I've seen good people get hurt chasing things too far above their reach, and I'd rather that not happen to you." "There's nothing growing," Elena said, but even she could hear how weak the denial sounded. Margaret only shook her head and did not argue the point, though the look she gave Elena on her way out carried more worry than the words themselves. Elena lay awake again that night, turning Margaret's warning over in her mind, and could not shake the fear underneath it. She had spent the last 2 years of her life running from a world where being noticed meant being in danger. She had left behind a pack in the north, where a former mate, cruel and possessive, had made it clear that she belonged to him, whether she wanted to or not, and she had escaped that only through sheer luck and the kindness of strangers along the road, who never asked too many questions. The last thing she needed, the very last thing, was to be noticed by the most powerful wolf in the entire territory. And yet every fiber of her being seemed to be leaning toward exactly that danger, pulled forward by something she did not choose and could not seem to stop. She began to notice other things too, strange things she had no explanation for. A warmth would spread through her chest whenever Cale entered a room, even before she saw him, as if some part of her sensed him before her eyes could confirm it. Her skin prickled with awareness on the nights he visited the kitchen, a feeling she had never experienced with anyone else in her life. Once, waiting for him without meaning to admit to herself that she was waiting, she caught herself baring the side of her neck slightly as she tilted her head to listen for footsteps in the hall, a gesture so instinctive and so strange that she froze the moment she realized what her own body had done. She did not understand what was happening to her. She only understood that it terrified her, because it reminded her of stories her mother used to tell, stories about fated mates and unbreakable bonds, stories Elena had convinced herself belonged only in old tales and not in the real, dangerous, complicated world she actually lived in. Cale returned from the border talks 4 days later, tired and tense but alive, and the moment word reached the kitchen that the Alpha King was back within the castle walls, Elena felt something in her chest unclench that she had not realized was clenched at all. He came to the kitchen that same night, later than usual, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but softening the instant they found her across the room. "You're back," Elena said, and immediately regretted how much relief had leaked into her voice. "I'm back," Cale agreed, and something about the small, tired smile he gave her made her chest ache in an entirely new way. They fell back into their quiet routine easily, as if the days apart had not happened at all, and Elena told herself that this, at least, was safe. Sitting together in a warm kitchen, sharing tea and small conversation, asked for nothing more than what they were already giving each other. It did not have to mean anything larger than two tired people finding a little peace in each other's company. She was wrong, though she would not fully understand how wrong, until the following week, when the fire broke out. It happened in the late afternoon, during the busiest hours of the kitchen, when every oven was lit and every pot was working, and the whole room moved like a well-rehearsed dance of heat and steam and clattering pans. Elena was reaching for a tray near the largest oven when one of the newer kitchen boys, rushing to carry a stack of firewood, knocked over a jar of oil near an open flame. The fire caught faster than anyone expected. One moment there was a small orange flicker near the base of the oven, and the next the flames had leapt up the wooden shelf beside it, catching the dry cloths hanging there, spreading with a hungry speed that sent the entire kitchen into chaos. Someone screamed. Pots crashed to the floor as people scrambled backward. Smoke began to fill the air in thick gray clouds, and Elena, closest to the growing fire, found herself trapped between the flames and a wall of overturned crates that had fallen in the panic, blocking her path to the door. She coughed, eyes stinging, heart hammering as the heat pressed closer, searching desperately for another way out and finding none. Word of the fire reached the guards within moments, and word of the fire reached Cale even faster, some instinct in him screaming alarm before anyone had even come to tell him directly. He was already moving before the messenger finished his sentence, running through the corridors faster than he had run in years, his wolf howling inside him, with a fear so sharp it bordered on agony. By the time he reached the kitchen, the smoke was thick and the flames had spread across half the room, staff pouring out through the main door in a panicked rush, coughing and calling out names, trying to account for everyone. Cale shoved past them, ignoring the guards who tried to hold him back, ignoring the heat that scorched his skin, driven by a certainty he could not explain and did not stop to question. He found her exactly where his instinct told him she would be, pressed against the far wall, trapped by fallen crates, flames licking dangerously close to where she stood. She was coughing hard, one arm raised to shield her face from the smoke, and the moment she saw him appear through the haze, relief and disbelief flashed across her face in equal measure. "My lord, you shouldn't." He did not let her finish. He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, hauled the crates aside with strength that came from somewhere far beyond ordinary human effort, and pulled her against him, sheltering her from the worst of the heat as he half carried, half dragged her back through the smoke toward the door. They burst out into the cooler air of the hallway together, both of them coughing, both of them shaking, and the guards immediately closed in to help extinguish the last of the flames, while the staff accounted for everyone, thankfully all present, all safe. The fire caught in time before it could claim more than a corner of the kitchen. Cale did not let go of Elena, not right away. He held her against his chest in the middle of the smoke-filled hallway, his heart still pounding from the terror of nearly losing her, and something inside him, some deep animal instinct that had been building for weeks, finally broke free of every restraint he had been holding it back with. His wolf surged forward with a force he had never felt before, and for one dangerous, overwhelming moment, every rational thought in his mind was replaced with a single, primal certainty. She was his, and he had almost lost her, and he was never letting that happen again. He felt her breath catch against his chest, felt the way her whole body had gone still in his arms, and he realized, with a jolt that ran cold through his veins even in the heat of the moment, exactly how close he had come to losing every ounce of control in front of half the castle staff. He released her, stepping back so quickly that Elena nearly stumbled and cleared his throat, forcing his voice back into something resembling a king's steady authority.
"Are you hurt?"
No. Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide and searching his face for an explanation to something she clearly did not understand any better than he did. "Thank you, my lord. You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," he said, though they both knew that was not entirely true. Not the way he had moved, not the desperation that had carried him through smoke and flame faster than any ordinary man could manage. He did not stay to explain further. He turned and walked away before she could ask any more questions, before his own composure could crack any further in front of witnesses, leaving Elena standing in the smoky hallway, with her heart racing, and her mind spinning, with the memory of being held like she was the single most precious thing in his entire world. That night, alone in his chambers, Kale sat with his head in his hands, his wolf finally quiet, finally settled, finally at peace, in a way it had not been in years. But peace was not what troubled him. What troubled him was how close he had come, in that hallway, to claiming a kitchen cook in front of his own guards without a single thought for consequence, for politics, for the impossible weight of everything a king was supposed to consider before acting on instinct. He did not have a name yet for what was happening to him. But he was beginning to suspect that whatever it was far too powerful to keep ignoring for much longer. Dorian had watched his king for many years, long enough to know the difference between a bad mood and something deeper, and what he had witnessed in the hallway outside the burning kitchen was not a bad mood. It was something he had never seen in Kale before, not once, not even in the worst moments of grief after they lost their parents together, all those years ago. He had arrived just after the fire was put out, in time to see Kale holding a kitchen worker against his chest, with a desperation that no king held anyone with, not unless that person meant more to him than duty allowed him to admit. He said nothing about it in the moment. There were more pressing matters, injured staff to check on, damage to assess, a kitchen to rebuild. But the image stayed with him, and over the following days, Dorian began paying closer attention to his king's movements than he ever had before. It was not difficult to notice the pattern once he started looking for it. Kale found reasons to walk past the east wing multiple times a day. He asked after the kitchen staff's well-being more often than any king reasonably needed to. He grew short-tempered and distracted whenever a meeting ran late into the evening, as if some part of him was eager to be elsewhere. And more than once, Dorian caught him staring into the middle distance with an expression that looked less like exhaustion and more like a man fighting something inside himself that he did not fully understand. Dorian was not a suspicious man by nature, but he was a careful one, and a king behaving strangely was never something a good beta could afford to ignore, especially with tensions at the northern border still simmering, and enemies who would happily exploit any weakness they could find in Ashbourne leadership. He began, quietly and without drawing attention, to ask a few careful questions about the kitchen staff. Most of what he learned was unremarkable. Margaret had run the kitchens for over 2 decades with an iron hand and a warm heart. The staff beneath her were loyal, hard-working, unremarkable in the way that good, steady people usually were. But one name kept surfacing in ways that caught his attention. Elena Marsh, hired only weeks earlier, with references that were thin, vague, and difficult to verify. That alone was not unusual. Plenty of people came to the capital looking for work, with little more than a willingness to labor hard and keep their heads down, and the castle rarely dug too deeply into the pasts of kitchen staff who posed no obvious threat. But combined with everything else Dorian had observed, the timing felt too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Kale's strange behavior had begun almost exactly when this new cook arrived. Dorian did not confront his king directly. He knew Kale well enough to understand that pushing too hard too soon on a subject his friend clearly was not ready to discuss would only make him retreat further behind his walls. Instead, Dorian decided to observe a little longer, to understand the shape of the problem before deciding whether it was truly a problem at all, or something else entirely that deserved a gentler kind of attention. Meanwhile, Kale was fighting a battle within himself that no strategy meeting or border negotiation had ever demanded of him. He kept replaying the moment in the hallway, the way his entire being had narrowed down to a single point of focus, the instant he thought Elena might be in danger. He had moved without thought, without hesitation, driven by something so far beyond ordinary concern that it frightened him more than any enemy pack ever had. He was the Alpha King. He had spent his entire life learning to master his instincts, to think 3 steps ahead of every threat, to never let emotion cloud a decision that could cost lives. And in that hallway, for the span of a single terrifying minute, he had lost all of that control completely. He told himself, over and over, that it could not mean what some quiet, insistent part of him suspected it might mean. Fated bonds were rare. He had heard of them, of course, growing up on stories the same as anyone else, but he had never expected to experience one himself, and certainly not with a kitchen cook who had walked into his life only a month ago carrying secrets he knew nothing about. He tried to stay away from the kitchens for 3 days after the fire, forcing himself through longer training sessions with his guard, burying himself in border correspondence late into the night, anything to keep his feet from carrying him toward the East Wing, the way they always seemed to want to go. It did not work. By the third night, his wolf had grown so restless, so insistent, pacing and clawing beneath his skin with a hunger that bordered on pain, that Cale finally gave up the fight and let his feet carry him where they had wanted to go all along. He found Elena in the newly repaired kitchen, quieter than usual, working with a careful stiffness that told him the fire had shaken her more than she had let on in the hallway. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression, a mixture of relief and wariness, told him that his 3 days of absence had not gone unnoticed, and had not gone unfelt. "My lord." She set down the knife she was using, and folded her hands in front of her apron, the posture of someone bracing for a conversation she was not sure she wanted to have. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I've been busy," Cale said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Of course, she did not push, though the flicker of hurt behind her eyes told him she had hoped for something better than a hollow excuse. He hated himself a little in that moment, hated the walls he was hiding behind, hated that the safest thing for both of them was probably to keep those walls firmly in place, and hated most of all that some deep, stubborn part of him did not care about safety at all, only about closing the distance between them. "I wanted to make sure you were truly unharmed," he said instead, gentler than before. "The fire could have been much worse." "I'm fine, my lord, thanks to you." She hesitated, then added, quieter, "I never got the chance to properly thank you for what you did. You don't need to thank me." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I would have done anything to make sure you were safe." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had meant them to be, and Elena's cheeks colored slightly as she looked away, busying her hands with the knife again, though her focus had clearly scattered. "You say that like it isn't strange," she said softly, "a king caring so much about a cook." Cale did not have an answer for that, not one he was ready to give voice to, not one he fully understood himself. He stayed a while longer, the silence between them less easy than usual, both of them carrying questions neither was brave enough to ask, and when he finally left, he carried with him the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever was happening between them had already grown too large to keep pretending it did not exist. Word of the fire and the king's dramatic rescue had spread quickly through the castle, as such things always did, and by the end of the week, whispers had begun to travel through the servants' quarters and even into the lower ranks of the guard. Nothing overt, nothing anyone would dare say directly to the king's face, but enough quiet speculation that Dorian, sharp as ever, began to hear fragments of it himself. Talk of the way the Alpha King had run into a burning kitchen without a second thought, the way he had held a simple cook like she was the most important person in the world. Dorian decided it was finally time to look a little deeper into who exactly Elena Marsh really was, and where exactly she had come from before she walked into his king's castle and, apparently, into something far more complicated than employment. What he would find, in the days that followed, would change everything. Dorian began his search, the way he began every serious investigation, quietly, patiently, and without letting anyone know he was looking at all. He sent a trusted rider north with careful questions to ask in the small towns along the road Elena claimed to have traveled, and he spoke, gently and without suspicion in his voice, to Margaret, who trusted him enough after years of working together to answer honestly. "She doesn't talk about her past," Margaret admitted, wiping flour from her hands as she spoke to him in a quiet corner of the newly repaired kitchen. "I've learned not to ask. Whatever she's running from, it still frightens her. I've seen her flinch at loud noises. I've seen her check the door twice before she feels safe enough to sleep in the servants' quarters." "Running from what, though?" Dorian asked carefully. Margaret shook her head. "I don't know, but I know fear when I see it, and that girl carries more of it than someone her age should have to." It was not much to go on, but it was enough to confirm what Dorian had already begun to suspect. Elena Marsh was hiding something significant, something that had followed her south even after she thought she had left it behind. The answer came back from his rider 8 days later, delivered quietly and directly into Dorian's hands, rather than pass through any official channel. It was a story pieced together from a handful of cautious townsfolk in a small settlement near the northern border, people who remembered a young woman matching Elena's description passing through months earlier, moving fast, looking over her shoulder, refusing to stay anywhere more than a single night. The story that emerged was not a pleasant one. Elena had come from a smaller pack near the northern edge of the territory, one that answered, loosely and uneasily, to the more aggressive Greyfen alliance that had been causing trouble at Ashbourne's border for months. She had been born into that pack, though according to the fragments Dorian's rider had gathered, her mother had kept her deliberately separate from most pack business, raising her in a small cottage on the outskirts rather than within the main settlement itself. No one seemed entirely sure why, though rumors suggested her mother had been protecting her from something, or someone, even before Elena was old enough to understand the danger herself. Her mother had died when Elena was still young, leaving her alone and vulnerable within a pack that had never fully accepted her as one of their own. And it was there, within that pack, that a rising young enforcer named Callum had taken a dangerous interest in her. An interest that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with the kind of possessive cruelty that some wolves mistook for claiming a mate. Dorian's informants used careful, measured words to describe what came next, but the shape of it was clear enough even without every detail spelled out. Elena had refused Callum's advances, more than once, and each refusal had been met with escalating pressure, until finally, on a night no one in the town could speak of without lowering their voices, Elena had fled the pack entirely, running south with nothing but the clothes on her back, and whatever coin she could carry, terrified that Callum's influence within the pack would eventually convince the pack's leadership to force the match regardless of her wishes. Dorian sat with that information for a long time before deciding what to do with it. It explained everything: the guarded silences, the flinching at sudden sounds, the careful, cautious way Elena kept herself apart from anyone who might ask too many questions. It also explained, with a chill that settled deep into Dorian's chest, exactly how dangerous her situation truly was, because the pack she had fled from answered to the Greyfen alliance, the very same alliance currently threatening war along Ashbourne's northern border. If Callum, or anyone loyal to him, discovered where Elena had gone, it would not simply be a matter of a jilted suitor seeking revenge. It could become a matter of state, a spark that the already tense border conflict did not need. And there was something else buried within the story, something Dorian's informants had mentioned almost as an afterthought, treating it as local superstition rather than fact. Whispers that Elena's mother herself had carried wolf blood from a bloodline far older and more powerful than the small pack she had settled into. A bloodline that had been hidden deliberately, generations back, for reasons no one in the present day fully remembered. Whether that was true or simply the kind of story small towns like to tell about tragic, mysterious young women, Dorian could not say for certain. But if it was true, it would explain something else that had been nagging at him since the fire: the sheer intensity of Cale's reaction to her, an intensity that went far beyond ordinary attraction, into territory that sounded, uncomfortably, like the old stories about fated bonds between wolves of significant lineage. Dorian brought the information to Cale 3 days later, choosing a private moment late in the evening when he was certain they would not be interrupted or overheard. Cale listened in silence as Dorian laid out everything he had learned, his jaw tightening with every new detail, his hands curling into fists against the arms of his chair as the story of Callum's cruelty unfolded. By the time Dorian finished, Cale's wolf was straining so hard against his control that he had to grip the chair to keep from rising, every protective instinct in him roaring to life at the thought of what Elena had survived, and what danger might still be following her. "She never said a word of this," Cale said quietly, once he trusted his voice enough to speak. "Would you have, in her position?" Dorian asked, not unkindly. "She's a woman alone, hiding from a pack tied to your enemies, working as a cook in the castle of the king, whose territory she fled into for safety. If word got out about who she truly is, or where she came from, it could put her in more danger than the one she already escaped." Cale absorbed that, his mind working through the implications, with the same sharp focus he applied to any threat against his territory, though this threat felt different, felt personal, in a way that made his chest ache with something far beyond duty. "And you believe this is connected to what I've been feeling?" Cale said slowly. It was not quite a question. Dorian met his eyes steadily. "I believe, Alpha, that you already know the answer to that better than I do. I've served beside you long enough to recognize when something has taken hold of you that isn't going away, no matter how hard you try to explain it away as exhaustion or hunger or coincidence." Cale said nothing for a long moment, staring into the low fire burning in the hearth of his private study, turning over weeks of restless nights and inexplicable pulls, and a calm that had settled into his chest the very first moment he laid eyes on a woman stirring soup at midnight. "If it's true," Kale said finally, quiet and rough, "if she is what I think she might be, then I have a responsibility to protect her. Not because of what she might be to me, but because no one deserves to live in fear the way she has been living." "And if it's true," Dorian said carefully, "you have a responsibility to be honest with her about what you've been feeling, before this Callum, or anyone else from that pack, decides to come looking for her themselves. She deserves to know the danger she may still be in. And she deserves to know why her king can't seem to stay away from his own kitchen." Kale let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for weeks, and for the first time since this had all begun, he allowed himself to fully consider the possibility his wolf had already accepted without hesitation. That Elena Marsh, the quiet, guarded cook who flinched at sudden noise and hid behind careful silences, might be the one person in the entire world his wolf had been searching for his whole life, and that somewhere out there, a man named Callum might still be searching for her too, with far less noble intentions than protection. The thought settled over Kale like a cold weight, and beneath the tenderness that had been steadily growing in his chest for weeks, a new and sharper instinct began to stir alongside it. Not just longing, not just curiosity. Something closer to warning. Something closer to the readiness for war. Elena felt the change in the castle before she understood the reason for it. It began as small things, the kind of shifts a person only noticed if they had spent years learning to read a room for danger. A guard who usually nodded politely now watched her a beat too long as she passed through the corridors. 2 maids fell silent when she entered the laundry room, their conversation cutting off so abruptly that she knew immediately it had been about her. Even Margaret, usually so steady and unbothered by castle gossip, had grown quieter around her, watching her with a worry that Elena could not quite place. "Is something wrong?" Elena finally asked, cornering Margaret in the pantry on a quiet afternoon. Margaret hesitated, clearly weighing how much to say. "There's talk, girl, about the fire, about the way the king carried you out of it. People notice things like that, and they talk, and talk has a way of traveling faster than truth." Elena's stomach dropped. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being unnoticed, of blending into whatever background she found herself in, and the idea that she had somehow become the subject of castle gossip terrified her more than she wanted to admit. If people were talking about her here, in the safety of Ashbourne's own walls, how long before that talk traveled further, carried by traders or messengers, or anyone passing through who might repeat an interesting story, to the wrong ears in the north? "It's nothing," Elena said, though her voice shook slightly. The king was simply doing his duty. Anyone would have done the same. Margaret gave her a long, knowing look but did not argue, and Elena spent the rest of the day with her nerves stretched tight, jumping at every sound, watching every doorway with a wariness she thought she had left behind months ago when she first crossed into Ashbourne territory, and believed, foolishly, that she had finally found somewhere safe. That night, Kale came to the kitchen later than usual, and the moment Elena saw his face, she knew something had changed. He looked at her differently, with a weight in his gaze that had not been there before, a careful, deliberate gentleness that felt almost like he was handling something fragile. "We need to talk," he said quietly, once the last of the kitchen staff had gone to their quarters and they were finally alone. Elena's heart began to pound, fear rising fast and sharp in her chest. "Have I done something wrong, my lord?" "No." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, though his eyes never left hers. "Elena, I know about Callum." The name hit her like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt her hands begin to tremble before she could stop them, and for a moment she could not speak at all, could only stare at him with the kind of raw, unguarded fear she had spent 2 years hiding from everyone around her. "How?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know that name?" "My beta looked into your background," Kale said gently, though he could see the words landing like another blow. "Not to expose you, Elena, to protect you. I needed to understand why my wolf reacted to you the way it has since the moment you arrived here, and in trying to understand that, we learned about what you survived before you came south." Elena's legs felt unsteady, and she reached for the edge of the table to keep herself upright. Humiliation and fear tangling together in her chest, until she could barely breathe. "You had no right," she said, though the anger in her voice was thin, mostly covering the terror underneath it. "That's my past. It's not yours to dig through." "You're right," Cale said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised her enough to make her look up at him again. "I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly, given you the choice to tell me yourself, rather than having Dorian investigate behind your back. That was wrong of me, and I understand if you're angry." His willingness to admit fault so plainly, without excuse or deflection, softened something in Elena's chest, despite herself, though the fear was still there, coiled tight beneath her ribs. "Is he coming here?" she asked quietly, unable to keep the question inside any longer. "Is Callum going to find me?" "I don't know," Cale admitted, because he refused to lie to her, even to offer false comfort. "But I promise you this. As long as you are within these walls, you are under my protection, and I will not let anyone from that pack, or anywhere else, bring you harm. Whatever happens between us, whatever you decide you want or don't want from me, that protection does not depend on it. You are safe here." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes before she could stop them, tears born from months of carrying a fear alone that she had never expected anyone else to understand, let alone promise to stand against on her behalf. She wiped at her face quickly, embarrassed by the display, but Cale did not look away, did not treat her tears as anything other than what they were, the release of a burden she had carried far too long by herself. "Why do you care so much?" she asked finally, the question she had been avoiding for weeks finally breaking free. "I'm a cook, my lord. You're the Alpha King. This makes no sense." Cale was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with the same care he would use in any negotiation that mattered more than his own life. "I think you already know why, even if neither of us has said it out loud yet. My wolf recognized something in you the very first night I walked into this kitchen. I've spent weeks trying to explain it away, as anything other than what it is, because the truth felt impossible, felt too large to accept. But I don't think it's impossible anymore, Elena. I think you might be my fated mate." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and enormous, and Elena felt her whole world tilt sideways at the sound of it. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind she refused to visit too often, that something like this might be true, but hearing him say it plainly, with none of the hesitation or denial either of them had been hiding behind for weeks, made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "I don't know if I can be that," she whispered, the fear returning in a different shape now, not fear of Callum, but fear of hoping for something as impossible and dangerous as belonging to a king. "I don't know if I know how to trust anyone with something like that again." "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Cale said, gentler than she had ever heard him. "I'm not asking you to. I only wanted you to know the truth, so that whatever choice you make going forward, you're making it with all the facts, and not with me hiding things from you the way Dorian and I have been these past few days." Elena nodded slowly, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and Cale, sensing she needed space more than further conversation, gave her a small, respectful bow, and left her alone in the quiet kitchen, with her thoughts racing, and her heart pounding harder than it ever had before. She stood there long after he left, staring at the dying embers of the hearth fire, turning his words over and over in her mind. Fated mate. A concept from old stories, from her mother's careful whispers before bed, now suddenly, impossibly attached to her own life, to a man whose title alone made the very idea feel absurd. But beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion of carrying secrets for so long, something else had begun to grow in her chest, small and fragile and entirely unfamiliar. Something that felt, despite every reason she had to distrust it, dangerously close to hope. 2 weeks passed after that conversation, and though nothing had been officially decided between them, something had shifted permanently in the space they shared. Cale no longer pretended his visits to the kitchen were about hunger or restlessness. Elena no longer pretended she did not wait for the sound of the door each evening. They talked more openly now, sharing pieces of themselves that had been locked away for years, and though neither of them spoke again of fated bonds or mates, the truth of it lived quietly between them in every glance, every small, careful touch. But peace within the castle walls did not mean peace beyond them, and the border situation with the Greyfen alliance had only grown worse. Reports came in weekly of skirmishes along the northern edge of Ashbourne territory, small enough not to be called open war, but frequent enough that Cale's advisors grew increasingly anxious. In an effort to ease tensions and buy time for diplomacy, Cale had agreed, reluctantly, to host a grand banquet, inviting representatives from every allied pack in the region, including a small delegation from the very alliance causing the trouble at the border, in the hope that face-to-face negotiation might accomplish what messengers and letters had failed to achieve. The castle buzzed with preparation for days leading up to the event. Every hall was polished, every banner rehung, every dish planned with meticulous care by Margaret and her staff, who had been working double shifts to ensure the banquet reflected well on their king. Elena, though she had no desire to be anywhere near a room full of important nobles, found herself swept up in the frantic energy of preparation anyway, kneading dough late into the night, testing recipes for dishes grand enough to impress visiting dignitaries. She did not think, not for a single moment, that she herself would be expected to serve at the banquet directly. That was not her role. She worked in the kitchen, not in the halls, and she had been counting on that distinction, to keep her safely out of sight during an event that would draw eyes from packs she desperately did not want looking in her direction. Fate, however, was rarely so accommodating. 2 days before the banquet, one of the senior serving staff fell seriously ill, followed the next morning by a second, who twisted her ankle badly enough to be confined to bed. With the household staff already stretched thin by the scale of the event, Margaret found herself short 2 experienced servers at the worst possible moment, and though she hated to do it, she had no choice but to pull kitchen staff to fill the gap, Elena among them. "I can't," Elena said the moment Margaret told her, panic rising fast and sharp in her chest. "Margaret, please, ask anyone else." "There is no anyone else," Margaret said gently, though her eyes carried genuine sympathy. "I know you'd rather stay hidden, girl, but I need capable hands in that hall, and you're one of the steadiest workers I have. It's one evening. You'll be serving at the edges of the room, not standing before the king's throne." Elena wanted to argue further, wanted to explain the real reason behind her fear. The terror that somewhere among those visiting delegations from allied packs might be someone connected to Callum, someone who might recognize her face, even after months of running and hiding. But she could not bring herself to explain all of that to Margaret, not fully, and in the end, she swallowed her fear and agreed, telling herself that a banquet hall full of important nobles was unlikely to include anyone paying attention to a simple server moving quietly along the edges of the room. She told Cale that evening, finding him in his study reviewing final preparations for the following night's event, and watched his expression shift immediately from surprise to concern. "You don't have to do this," he said at once. "I can find another way to cover the staffing shortage." "Margaret needs the help," Elena said, though her voice betrayed how much the idea frightened her. "It's only one evening. I'll stay near the back, keep my head down. It should be fine." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between respecting her decision and the sharp, protective instinct that flared to life at the thought of her standing anywhere near delegates connected to the very alliance she had fled. "If you feel unsafe at any point, for any reason, you leave the hall immediately. Do you understand me? I don't care what protocol says about servers finishing their duties. Your safety comes before any of that." "I understand," Elena said softly, touched by the intensity of his concern despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. The night of the banquet arrived with a grandeur Elena had never witnessed in her life. The great hall had been transformed, long tables draped in fine cloth, candles glowing warm and golden along every surface, musicians playing softly from a raised platform near the far wall. Nobles and pack representatives from across the region filled the room in their finest clothing, the air thick with the low hum of careful political conversation and the clink of silver against porcelain. Elena moved through it all with her head down, exactly as she had promised, carrying trays of food and refilling cups along the edges of the room, doing her best to remain as invisible as she had trained herself to be for the past 2 years. It worked, for the most part. No one paid particular attention to a quiet server weaving carefully between tables, and for the first hour, Elena began to believe she might survive the evening without incident. Then, midway through the second course, one of the head table servers spilled a tray of wine across a nobleman's sleeve, causing enough commotion that Margaret, overseeing the hall from a discreet corner, needed someone reliable to step in immediately and cover the head table service until the situation could be smoothed over. Her eyes swept the room and landed, with unfortunate inevitability, on Elena, the steadiest hand available, and closest to the disruption. "Elena," Margaret whispered urgently, catching her arm as she passed. "I need you at the head table. Just for a few minutes, until I can sort out a replacement." Elena's stomach dropped. The head table sat closest to the king's throne, in full view of every important guest in the hall, including the small delegation from the north that she had been so carefully avoiding all evening. But there was no time to argue, no graceful way to refuse, without drawing exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid, and so she nodded, swallowed her fear, and moved toward the head table with a tray balanced carefully in her hands. She kept her eyes down as she approached, focusing entirely on the careful placement of each dish, the steady pour of each cup, trying to become as small and unnoticeable as possible despite standing directly in the most visible position in the entire hall. She could feel Cale's presence beside her the moment she drew close, could feel the warmth radiating from him even without looking up, and some small, foolish part of her allowed herself a moment of comfort in his nearness, even here, even now. She did not notice, in that brief moment of distraction, the way the delegation from the north had gone quiet at the sight of her. She did not notice the sharp, sudden focus in the eyes of one particular guest seated further down the table, a man who had traveled south with the northern delegation under a false name, watching the serving staff with far more interest than any innocent guest ever should. She only noticed, as she leaned forward to fill the king's cup, the way Cale's entire body went rigid beside her, the way his breath caught sharply, the way his eyes, when she finally dared to glance up, had gone dark and intense and utterly, completely focused on her, in a way that had nothing to do with the careful mask of a king hosting a diplomatic dinner. Something had changed in an instant, something enormous, and Elena had no idea yet exactly what it was, only that the room around them seemed to fade into irrelevance, leaving nothing but the two of them and whatever powerful, undeniable thing had just crashed into place between them, in front of every important guest gathered in that hall. The scent hit Cale like a wall of fire the moment Elena leaned close enough to fill his cup. He had caught traces of her scent before, of course, during their quiet evenings in the kitchen, but always faint, always muted by distance and the countless other smells of a working kitchen. Here, this close, with her wrist brushing near his hand as she poured, the full truth of her scent hit him, with a force that stole the air from his lungs entirely. It was unmistakable. It was the scent of a fated mate, clear and undeniable, and layered with something ancient, that spoke directly to the wolf inside him, rather than to his conscious mind at all. His wolf surged forward with a violence he had never experienced, every instinct screaming at him to claim her, to mark her, to declare to the entire hall exactly what she meant to him, consequences be damned. He gripped the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went white, forcing himself to remain seated, to remain composed, while every cell in his body strained toward the woman standing beside him. Elena felt the shift immediately, felt the sudden tension radiating off him, and though she did not fully understand what had triggered it, some instinct of her own responded in kind. Her pulse quickened, warmth spread through her chest and down her arms, and beneath the surface of her own careful composure, something ancient stirred inside her too, recognizing in him the same undeniable truth he had just recognized in her. Neither of them could speak of it there, in front of dozens of watching eyes, and so they both forced themselves through the remainder of the awkward, charged moment, Elena finishing her pour with hands that trembled only slightly, Cale thanking her, with a voice pitched carefully, to sound like ordinary courtesy, rather than the storm raging beneath it. She stepped back from the table as quickly as decorum allowed, retreating toward the edges of the hall where Margaret had finally arranged a replacement server, and Cale watched her go with a hunger in his chest that no amount of self-control seemed able to fully suppress. He forced himself through the remainder of the banquet, through careful diplomatic conversation with representatives from pacts whose loyalty could not be fully trusted, through toasts and pleasantries, and the delicate political dance required of any king hosting delegates from a hostile alliance. But his attention kept drifting toward the edges of the room, toward the quiet woman who had just become, in the span of a single accidental moment, the center of his entire world. He did not notice, absorbed as he was in his own overwhelming discovery, the way one particular guest at the far end of the table had grown unusually still during that same charged exchange, watching Elena's retreat toward the kitchen doors with an intensity that had nothing to do with diplomatic curiosity. The man calling himself a minor representative from the Northern Alliance had traveled south for reasons that had little to do with the official business of the delegation. He had spent months searching for a young woman who had fled his pack under circumstances he preferred to describe, to anyone who asked, in terms far kinder than the truth deserved. He had followed rumors and half-confirmed sightings across 3 territories, and he had very nearly given up hope of finding her at all, until tonight, when a serving girl with a familiar face and a familiar, cautious way of moving had leaned across the king's table to pour wine. He said nothing during the remainder of the banquet. He smiled where smiling was expected, laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny, and gave no outward sign of the discovery that had just reordered every plan he had carried south with him. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind was already working, already calculating how best to confirm what his eyes had just told him, and what he might do with that confirmation once the banquet ended and the castle settled into the quieter, less watched hours of the night. Elena, meanwhile, spent the remainder of the evening in the relative safety of the kitchen, hands trembling as she helped Margaret manage the final courses, her mind consumed entirely by the memory of Cale's reaction at the head table. She had felt something shift in that moment, something too large and too undeniable to explain away as simple attraction or nervousness. Whatever fragile hope had been growing in her chest over the past weeks had just become something far more certain and far more frightening, all at once. The banquet finally ended well past midnight, guests retiring to their assigned chambers throughout the castle, the great hall slowly emptying of its noise and light until only servants remained, clearing the last of the dishes in exhausted silence. Cale found Elena in the kitchen not long after, both of them worn thin by an evening that had asked far more of them than either had expected. "You felt it too," Cale said quietly, once the last of the kitchen staff had finally gone to bed, leaving them alone in the dim, banked light of the hearth. It was not a question. "I don't know what I felt," Elena admitted, though the tremor in her voice suggested she understood more than she was willing to say aloud. "It was so strong, my lord. I've never felt anything like it." "I have," Cale said softly. "Only once. Tonight, when you leaned close enough for me to finally catch your full scent. Elena, there's no more doubt in me. You're my fated mate. I felt it in every part of me, undeniable and complete." Elena's breath caught, tears gathering unbidden at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by weeks of denial, finally giving way to a truth too large to keep pushing aside any longer. Part of her wanted to run toward it, to let herself finally believe in something as impossible and beautiful as being chosen, completely and irrevocably, by a man whose gentleness had surprised her at every turn since the night they met. But another part of her, the part shaped by 2 years of running and hiding and surviving on nothing but her own careful vigilance, recoiled from the enormity of it, terrified of what it might mean to be seen so completely, to be claimed so publicly, when the very reason she had fled her old life in the first place had been a man who believed claiming her gave him rights over her that she never agreed to give. "I need time," she whispered, backing a step away from him despite the ache in her chest that told her to do the opposite. "Please, Cale. This is everything I've been afraid of, and everything I never let myself hope for. All at once. I can't just accept it in a single night." "You don't have to," Cale said immediately, gentleness overriding every instinct in him that wanted to close the distance between them instead. "Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. I've waited my whole life without knowing I was waiting. I can wait a little longer for you to be ready." She nodded, grateful beyond words for his patience, and retreated to her small room in the servants' quarters that night, carrying a heart too full and too frightened to allow for sleep. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy rest sometime near dawn, that the man who had once made her life a waking nightmare was sleeping under the very same roof that night, close enough to find her, and already making plans to do exactly that, before the sun rose on a new and far more dangerous day. Elena woke before dawn out of habit, the kitchen demanding its earliest hours long before the rest of the castle stirred, and she moved through the quiet corridors toward the east wing with her mind still full of the previous night, still unsteady with the weight of everything Cale had said to her. She did not expect anyone else to be awake at that hour, which was why the sound of footsteps behind her, deliberate and unhurried, sent a jolt of alarm through her entire body before she had even turned to look, She knew him instantly, even in the dim light of the early morning corridor, even dressed in the fine clothing of a diplomatic guest, rather than the rougher gear she remembered from her old pack. Callum had changed little in the months since she had last seen him, the same cold, confident set to his shoulders, the same smile that had once made her stomach turn with dread rather than warmth. Elena, he said her name softly, almost fondly, as if the months of terror he had caused her meant nothing at all. I wondered if the rumors were true. A serving girl at the Ashbourne banquet with your face. I have to admit, you've done well for yourself, hiding among royalty. Stay away from me. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared he could hear it. You ran from me, Callum said, taking a slow step closer, without so much as a word. Do you know what that did to my standing within the pack? I've spent months tracking down where you disappeared to, and here you are, working as a common cook for a king who has no idea what he's harboring under his own roof. I don't belong to you, Elena said, backing away, searching the empty corridor for any sign of help, any door she could reach before he closed the distance between them. I never did. You need to leave. Callum's expression darkened, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to show the temper underneath it that Elena remembered all too well. You'll come with me now, quietly, and we'll avoid any unpleasant scenes that might embarrass your precious king in front of his guests. Or you can make this difficult, and we'll see how quickly this whole castle learns exactly what kind of trouble their new cook has brought into their walls. Fear and fury collided in Elena's chest, and for one desperate moment she considered screaming, considered fighting, considered every option that might get her out of this corridor, without him laying a single hand on her. But before she could decide, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the far end of the hallway, and a pair of castle guards, alerted by the raised voices, rounded the corner with hands already moving toward their weapons. Is there a problem here? One of the guards asked sharply, eyes moving between Callum and Elena with immediate suspicion. Callum's mask slid smoothly back into place, all pleasant courtesy once more. No problem at all, simply catching up with an old friend. The guards did not look entirely convinced, but with no clear evidence of wrongdoing, and a guest bearing diplomatic status from the visiting delegation, they had little grounds to intervene further beyond watching Callum retreat with careful, unhurried steps back toward the guest wing, throwing one final look over his shoulder at Elena that promised this was far from finished. Elena did not wait to see him disappear from view. The moment the guards turned their attention elsewhere, she fled toward the kitchen, hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the door, and once inside, alone, she finally allowed herself to collapse against the wall and shake with the full force of the fear she had been holding back. She could not stay. The thought crystallized in her mind with terrifying clarity, even through the panic clouding her thoughts. Callum knew where she was now. He would not simply leave, not after months of searching for her, and every moment she remained within Ashbourne's walls put not only herself, but everyone around her in danger, including, especially, a king who had just opened his heart to her in a way she had never expected anyone to do again. She could not let Chaol go to war over her. She could not let a fragile peace with the Northern Alliance shatter because of a personal vendetta that had nothing to do with Ashbourne's people or their safety. The thought of Chaol and his people suffering, of soldiers dying in a conflict sparked entirely by her presence in his castle, settled over her like a suffocating weight, and by the time her shaking finally subsided, Elena had made a decision that felt like tearing something vital out of her own chest. She would leave. Quietly, before anyone noticed, before Chaol could talk her out of it with the same gentle patience that had won over every wall she'd built against him. She would disappear again, the way she had disappeared from her old pack, and this time, she would make certain no trail led anyone back to wherever she ended up next. She packed the small bag of belongings she had brought with her to the castle in the gray light just before dawn, moving quickly and silently through the servants' quarters, and slipped out through a side entrance used mostly for deliveries, avoiding the main gates and their watchful guards entirely. By the time the castle began stirring for the day, Elena was already well beyond the outer walls, moving fast along a path that led away from everything she had begun, foolishly, to hope she might finally be allowed to keep. Chaol discovered she was missing less than an hour later, when he arrived at the kitchen expecting to find her starting the morning's bread, and instead, found Margaret standing near an empty workstation, with a folded note clutched in her hands, her expression grim. She left this, Margaret said, holding it out to him. "I found it tucked under the flour tin. She's gone, my lord." Cale's whole body went cold as he unfolded the note, reading Elena's careful, apologetic handwriting explaining, in words that broke his heart with every line, that she could not let him risk his kingdom for her sake, that she was grateful for everything he had shown her, but could not stay and watch him pay the price for loving someone as dangerous to know as she apparently was. His wolf howled inside him with a grief and fury so intense it nearly buckled his knees, and for one terrible moment, standing alone in the kitchen where he had first found his entire world settling into place, Cale felt something close to despair. But despair lasted only a moment before something far stronger took its place: determination. He was the Alpha King. He commanded armies. He had faced down rival pacts and border threats, and years of political maneuvering, without ever once losing his composure. He was not going to lose the one thing that had finally made his restless wolf feel whole, not without fighting for her with everything he had. "Dorian," he called sharply, already moving toward the door, already shouting orders that sent guards scrambling into motion throughout the castle. "Gather the fastest riders. We're finding her, and we're finding her now." Within the hour, Cale was mounted and riding hard through the castle gates, his wolf screaming inside him, with a single, unbending purpose: chasing down the fading trail of the one person in the world he refused to let disappear from his life without a fight. Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos of the search, a message was already being sent north from the guest quarters, carried by a rider loyal to Callum rather than to Ashbourne, informing his allies that the woman they had been searching for had fled the castle alone and undefended, and offering a very useful head start on exactly where to intercept her before the king's search parties could catch up. The race for Elena's future had begun, and it was far from certain, in that tense and desperate morning, which side would reach her first. Elena moved as fast as her legs could carry her, following back roads and forest paths she remembered from her journey south months earlier, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and the castle before anyone realized she was gone. But grief slowed her steps more than she wanted to admit, every mile away from Cale, feeling like another piece of herself left behind on the road, and by mid-morning, exhausted and heartsick, she stopped to rest beside a quiet stream, telling herself she only needed a moment before continuing on. It was there, in that brief moment of stillness, that she heard riders approaching, and her heart lurched with the certain, sickening knowledge that her head start had not been long enough. She scrambled up, ready to run again, when she recognized the lead rider's silhouette against the morning light, and something in her chest cracked open with a relief so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees. "Elena." Cale's voice carried across the clearing as he swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, closing the distance between them in long, urgent strides. "Thank the stars. You're safe." "You shouldn't have come," Elena said, though her voice broke on the words, betraying how desperately glad she was that he had. "Cale, please, you need to go back. If Callum's people find you here." "I don't care what Callum's people find," Cale said fiercely, closing the last of the distance and taking her face gently between his hands, as if reassuring himself she was truly real and truly unharmed. "I told you I would protect you, and I meant every word of it. I am not letting you disappear from my life because you're trying to protect me from a fight I would gladly face 1,000 times over for your sake." "I can't ask that of you," Elena whispered, tears finally spilling over, despite her best efforts to hold them back. "Your kingdom, your people, they need you whole and focused, not risking everything for a cook who brought her own troubles to your doorstep." "You didn't bring trouble to my doorstep," Cale said firmly, brushing her tears away with a tenderness that undid the last of her resistance. "You brought yourself. Everything else, every bit of danger following you, that belongs to the man who caused it, not to you. I will not let you carry guilt for surviving something that was never your fault." Before Elena could respond, one of Dorian's scouts came riding hard from the tree line, calling out an urgent warning. A group of armed riders had been spotted moving fast from the north, cutting across country in a direction that would intercept their position within minutes. Cale's expression hardened instantly, protective instinct overriding every other emotion as he pulled Elena behind him, positioning himself between her and the coming threat, while his guards formed a defensive line around them both. The riders emerged from the trees moments later, Callum at their head, his earlier pleasant mask completely abandoned now, replaced with the cold fury of a man who believed something rightfully his had been stolen from him. "Step aside," Callum called out, his eyes fixed on Elena over Cale's shoulder. "This doesn't concern Ashbourne. She belongs to my pack. Hand her over, and there's no need for this to become a larger conflict than it already is." "She belongs to no one but herself," Cale said, his voice carrying the full authority of a king who had faced down far greater threats than a handful of overconfident riders. "And she has chosen to stay under my protection. If you have a grievance, you may bring it before the proper channels of pack law, but you will not threaten her while she stands on Ashbourne soil." Callum's men shifted uneasily, clearly outnumbered by the Ashbourne guards who had caught up along the road, weapons drawn but disciplined, awaiting only their king's command. Callum himself hesitated, calculation flickering behind his anger, as he weighed the reality of his position against the fury that had driven him this far. "This isn't over," Callum finally spat, though the retreat in his posture told a different story than his words. "The Greyfen Alliance will hear of this. Ashbourne is harboring a fugitive from Northern Pack Law, and there will be consequences." "Then let them come," Cale said evenly, unshaken. "I will answer any formal challenge through proper channels, and I promise you, the truth of what you did to drive her from her home will not remain hidden much longer either. Threaten her again, and it will not be diplomacy you face from me." Something in Cale's absolute, unwavering certainty finally broke through Callum's remaining bravado, and after a long, tense moment, he pulled his horse around and rode back toward the north, with his men trailing uneasily behind him, defeated for now, though the promise of future trouble lingered heavy in the air behind them. Elena let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for months, her legs finally giving out from the release of tension, and Cale caught her before she could fall, holding her steady against his chest in the middle of the quiet clearing, while his guards kept careful watch around them. "It's over," Cale murmured against her hair, though they both understood there would likely be further political consequences to navigate in the weeks ahead. "You're safe. I promise you, whatever comes from this, you are safe, and you are not facing any of it alone anymore." Elena pulled back just enough to look up at him, her heart finally settling into something she had not felt in over 2 years, a fragile, precious sense of safety she had almost given up believing she deserved. "I was so afraid," she admitted softly, "of wanting this, of believing something so good could actually be mine." "I understand that fear better than you might think," Cale said, gentle and honest. "I spent weeks denying what my own wolf already knew, terrified of what it might mean to want something this much. But I don't want to deny it anymore, Elena. I choose you. Not because my wolf demands it, though it certainly does, but because every part of who I am, the king and the man both, wants nothing more than to spend the rest of my life earning your trust." Elena felt the last of her walls, built brick by careful brick over years of survival, finally crumble away entirely, and for the first time since her mother's death, she allowed herself to simply feel something, without immediately calculating the danger and feeling it. "I choose you too," she whispered, and the words felt like the truest thing she had ever said. They returned to the castle together that afternoon, riding side by side rather than as king and rescued servant, and though the political complications of Callum's accusations would take weeks of careful diplomacy to fully resolve, Cale handled every bit of it with the same steady determination he brought to every challenge his kingdom faced, refusing at every turn to let anyone question Elena's place beside him. In the months that followed, Elena's true heritage came fully to light. The old bloodline whispered about in northern rumors confirmed through careful research into her mother's history, and the castle that had once seen her only as a quiet kitchen worker came to know her as something far greater, though she never once let that new status make her forget the simple, honest work that had brought her into Cale's life in the first place. She still visited the kitchen often, teaching Margaret's newest workers the recipes she had learned there, and Cale still found reasons to wander toward the East Wing some evenings, though now he no longer needed any excuse at all, beyond simply wanting to be near her. His wolf, restless for so many years before she arrived, had finally found the peace it had been searching for all along, and it never wandered toward the kitchen alone in the dark again, because it never needed to search anymore. It had already found exactly where it belonged.